in the Plano area. It's kind of like West County is to St. Louis. But I was sharing one of the unique things that I found as I've lived in Missouri and Arkansas is kind of the sports dynamic in the Metroplex. You may not be sports people and do the sports ball or whatever, it is. And so, but it is kind of a fun time with, sports all around. But in Arkansas, for example, the sports dynamic, all they have is the Arkansas Razorbacks. Electricity, good. Yay. Okay, we're good. It's fine, everything's fine. Anything else, they just have the Arkansas Razorbacks. I remember being on staff there and having to have a planning meeting about when we're going to have whatever it was, and they're like, "Oh, when are the Arkansas Razorbacks playing?" I'm like, I was sitting there as someone. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" I've never thought about considering when a sports team is playing, other I guess the Cowboys, but it was a very unique learning experience because it was just the Razorbacks. Here in Missouri, I'm learning. You have the Cardinals, you've got the Blues, you've got the Chiefs, you've got Mizzou. Generally speaking, it feels like you have one main team for each of these. I know, you've got the Cardinals, and I guess you've got the Kansas City, what are they, the Royals? Is that even a thing? It kind of is, but it's not at the same time. At least it feels that way. Okay, thank you. They're answering my question. They are not a thing. They're not a thing. In Texas, you had like multiple teams for everything. Like in college, you'd have Texas A&M, you'd have UT, you'd have Texas Tech, you'd have Baylor, you'd have TCU, and that's just college. Professional teams would be all over the place. My point is that you'd have this crazy diversity in this sports realm, and that would not necessarily lead to people just getting along. That diversity, it led to a lot of difficulty and a lot of disunity. I can't tell you the number of times I saw an LSU fan and an Alabama fan like not fighting, but like having a heated disagreement. And it's like, we're in Texas. Like, it's just amazing the feelings that people can feel. In the midst of the diversity, it had with it a natural diversity, a natural difficulty. Diversity, natural difficulty. And I think this is generally the case. In a natural sense, diversity, it brings with it a degree of difficulty. I mean, Republicans probably just don't love talking politics with the Democrats. If you're a comic person, Marvel fans probably feel very strongly in ways that DC, comic people don't want to talk to them. I don't know about comic stuff. I'm trying to be relevant. Anyways. Cardinals fans, here we go, don't naturally, like watching baseball with Cubs fan. Did I do the St. Louis thing? Did I do it? Right? Yeah, whatever. The way we work, we naturally flock towards people who look like us and talk like us and have the same interests as us. And why am I telling you this? Because as we jump in, once again, to the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is writing this letter to a very diverse church. The church in Corinth, it's made up of Jews and Gentiles. It's made of young people and older people, rich people and also some of the poorest of people, people with a religious background, and some people have no religious background at all. And what we saw is this diversity in the church, it brought with it conflict, challenges, and difficulty. And what Paul then begins to do, he begins to talk about the gospel. And he talks about how the gospel, in the midst of all the natural feelings that you and I might feel in the midst of diversity, the gospel, it aims to serve as a bridge of sorts that provides a supernatural unity because it's in Christ. And so in our text, you see this bridge at work, and I want to show it to you. So we're going to walk through our text, we're going to point out what Paul's saying, and then we're going to have kind of three take-homes for us as a church. So look with me in verse 19. He says, For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. So in our passage, Paul leverages two main analogies to describe what the gospel has done in him and how it's working in him. And the first one, we see it in verse 19. And it's in that phrase in the middle. He says, servant to all. That's what my translation says. He says, though I'm free from all, I've made myself a servant to all. Your translation, it might say a slave to all. That's probably a better translation. Because the Greek word used here is not the word referring to house servants, which is totally a thing and something that they would have understood. Paul is using the word doulos, which is referring to slaves and bondservants. And so what you see Paul doing in this moment, he's grabbing this horrible concept of slavery. And yet it's a concept that his context would understand and would know. It's this institution where someone had a complete ownership and control of somebody else, and he's using that, and he's grabbing that analogy to describe his relationship to the gospel. But the language he's using is I'm a slave to all. I'm a servant to all. Who's this to all? Who's he talking about? Well, he gives several examples. Look at verse 20. He says, to the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews, which is so interesting, right? Because if you know Paul, he's Jewish. He's already Jewish. And so when he says, I became as a Jew, what is he talking about? He's talking about ways that he would connect with people, ways that he would connect to his audience. The distinctly Jewish elements of Paul's culture and his ethnicity, Paul understood he could play them up or he could play them down based off of the needs of the conversation or the moment. And then he keeps going. In verses 20, he gives another example. He says, to those under the law, I became as one under the law. And then verse 21, he says, to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. And so Paul, he's serving as a servant of those under the law by becoming as one under the law. And so what that doesn't mean, he's not saying that he's going back to his old life where he's looking to the law and God's obeying God's commands as a means for salvation. That's not what he's meaning. And similarly, when Paul says he's becoming like those outside the law, Paul's not saying he's just casting aside all morality and just living as a heathen. That's not what he's saying. What he means is whatever the diversity he's stepping into, Paul was willing to step into that culture with them. He was willing to live in their world with them and do life on their turf. But to what end? Why? What's he laboring towards? Look at the end of verse 19. He says, that I might win more of them. That I might win more of them. He just repeats this over and over just in case you missed it. Look, let's read it, the verses. He says, for though I am free from all, I made myself servant to all. What? That I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. No matter who it is, Paul says, I've become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Meaning that I might be best positioned to point whoever that is to Jesus. And in verse 23, he says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. You see the trend? Ultimately, Paul is not a slave to any people. He's a slave to the gospel. Meaning, when Paul sees these various expressions of diversity in Corinth, he's not being driven by what he wants, by what feels right to him, what would be comfortable in that moment, what his opinions might be about them, or his preferences. All those feelings are subservient to something. There's one driving, all-consuming question that's driving Paul, and it's this question: how can I reach more people with the gospel? It's a convicting question to help have land on you. How can I reach more people? Who cares what I think? Who cares what I want in this moment? What's the best way to reach people with the gospel? That's his first analogy. The second analogy, he elaborates further in verse 24. Look at verse 24. He says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So analogy number one is he's a slave to the gospel. Analogy number two is he's using this picture of a professional athlete. Last night I was watching the Kansas City Chiefs game, which, by the way, go Chiefs, right? But I saw over and over the commercials for the Summer Olympics in Paris. I love the Olympics. I think it's just so fun. I think they're better than the Winter Olympics, just my opinion. But one of my favorite sports to watch is swimming. Many of you know Michael Phelps. He's the most decorated Olympian of all time. He's got 28 gold medals. I heard someone, everything's fine. Ugh. Are we okay? Is it safe? Yeah, we'll do our best. Will did it. We tried. So, yeah. If it gets terrible, then we will. So, but Michael Phelps. So I heard someone describe his gold medal accomplishments as he's earned more gold medals than like 70% of the countries that participate in the Olympics, and more gold that they've ever accumulated in their entire history. Anyways, go USA, right? But there are two elements to Michael Phelps' success in swimming, and really just any swimmer's success, that kind of blows my mind. The first one is they have to get rid of anything and everything that keeps them from winning. So, for example, personally, I don't shave my legs. I know you were wondering, but no, I don't shave my legs. I'm not a Speedo guy. Sorry for that image, but wearing one of those rubber caps is not generally the look that I'm going for. I'm more of like a, shorts and wear your shirt while you're swimming so the sun doesn't murder you type of guy. But if I wanted to be a competitive swimmer, I'd have to embrace that. I'd have to shave the legs. I'd have to, finish the sentence. And I apologize for the mental picture, but anything that slowed Michael Phelps down, gone. But not only that, second, he has to implement crazy self-discipline. And I heard in a video him describing what his training looked like. He would swim for 1,800 consecutive days, 12 miles. Like, swim 12 miles. Every single day, no breaks on Christmas, not on his birthdays. I mean, every single day for 1,800 consecutive days. And he would eat somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12,000 calories each day to do this. He'd have like pasta for lunch and a pound of pasta for dinner. And so I guess if we're just wondering, you want to lose weight, just swim 12 miles a day. I mean, that's what we've been missing, right? No. I mean, it's wild. And this is what it took for him to become an Olympic champion. The depressing thing is that when my kids, or my, Lord willing, grandkids, when they hear Michael Phelps' name, they're going to be like, who's that? Who's that? His record for gold medals probably one day will be broken. And those gold medals will probably one day just gather dust in some museum. In verse 25, Paul says this. He says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things, and they do it to receive a perishable wreath. But we exercise discipline for an imperishable, for something that lasts forever. And so Paul's saying, if athletes, they train like they do for crowns that will perish one day, how much more should we as believers in Jesus be willing to discipline our lives and to do so for the souls of people who last forever? The crowns we're striving for, it's not for our name to be made great or for our name to be once put on a plaque and it hangs in the rafters or something like that. We're laboring for a crown, which is the souls of our neighbors, your coworkers, your kids, grandkids, family members. This is what he's saying. So what does this mean? I've got three things I want us to consider together. The first one is this, is we as a church, we must sacrifice preference to reach the lost. This is a difficult thing. If we want to reach people, we have to sacrifice our preferences in order for that to happen. One of my favorite TV shows is called Parks and Recreation. And like most shows that are funny, I can't commend everything they do, but there's this one episode where the city of Pawnee is trying to find a new mural for their city building because they have this horrific history, and for some reason they make murals out of their terrible history. But the government, they say, hey, we need better murals, and so they reach out to the offices like police and sanitation, et cetera, and they ask them to come up with their own murals. And so the Parks and Rec office, they reach out to the people and they say, hey, let's all come up with our own murals because the office with the best mural, it gets hung in the building. And so what happens is each member of the Parks and Rec department, they come up with their own murals, and they're all just completely ridiculous. Like one is very bland, another is incredibly abstract. It's just like a bunch of shapes, and it's like that has nothing to do with Pawnee. It says another one is absolutely horrifying with, all sorts of things involving a hamster wheel. The one good idea in the office is from the guy who's just like perpetually made fun of. So what happens is when they vote for whose mural is the best one, what happens? Everyone just votes for themselves. They just vote for themselves, and so they can't get over what they think is great, what their opinion is and what their preference is. And so what happens is they're in a stalemate. They can't agree on something, and this big, important task that they've been given, it can't happen because the group's so divided by these secondary things. And so here's the point. In a couple weeks, we're going to talk about the Great Commission, but we've talked about the Great Commission a lot here at Chesterfield Community Church. The Great Commission of making disciples of all nations, this is our big task. This is the big task that God has given to us, the church, to labor towards until Jesus comes back. And yet what happens so often, or what can happen so easily, is where we let our comfort, our opinions, our preferences, our thoughts on secondary issues, it can eclipse this big, important task to where it doesn't get done. And it doesn't get done because what's happening is as our comfort becomes top priority, our preferences become center stage in our world, and what happens, we end up pushing people away from Jesus. And this big task that we've been tasked with, it doesn't get done. It can't happen. It reminded me of when I first moved here, and it was when when we were gathering, everyone was wearing masks. And then we would have to kind of move out of that. And I don't know your story, I don't know a lot about you, but I know this. You probably had thoughts and opinions about that whole thing. And here's the deal, you were probably right, whatever they were, right? But you know what? Here's the deal. There comes a point when either our opinions and our strong feelings about something is going to win the day, or reaching people with the gospel will win the day. There comes a moment where those two things will come head to head, and in the moment, what's going to win? And I'm not saying that we have to be silent about issues that are important to us, but the context of 1 Corinthians 9 is within chapters 8 and 9. Paul is sacrificing rights left and right. Rights like his right to eat certain food, his right to drink, his right to take on a believing wife, his right to get paid from the church. Like he's sacrificing all these preferences, rights that he absolutely could cling to, and yet he's sacrificing them because it's not about himself. It's not about him getting his rights, and it's about reaching out to people with the gospel. And of course, again, don't hear me like we should be informed people. We should have strong convictions, and we should live out of those. But again, when these secondary convictions and our preferences and our comforts, when they go head to head with reaching people for Jesus, only one can win. And that's all I'm talking about. We must sacrifice preference to reach the lost. If something happens here at CCC, and I'm not laboring to make us all uncomfortable, but if at any moment it's a matter of us reaching people and us being comfortable, what are we going to do? What do you want to do? Do we want to reach people, or do we want to be comfortable and sacrifice? I know our church. I'm just telling us things that we already know. We must sacrifice preference at times to reach people. But secondly, We must care not only about depth, but about breadth, or width, you could write. We can't just care about depth. We also have to care about breadth. I came into ministry 12 years ago at a time where I feel like in my peers that I was talking to, we were kind of sick about churches who were a mile wide and an inch deep. And the youth ministry version of that would be like, the youth pastor would be like, hey, bring all your friends. We're giving away free iPods. Remember iPods, right? Big free iPods and big screen TVs. And everybody was like, yeah. And they'd get this huge crowd. And then it's like they would trick people into responding to the gospel. And then you'd be so happy. And then what would actually happen is when life gets real and hard, of course, it would reveal those people who didn't actually respond to the gospel. And so there was a trend in my circle, at least within my world at that time, where we wanted to kind of reject that, where we wanted to focus on going deep with people. And hear me, I think that is right. But the question is to what end? Like what should be the result of us going deep with Jesus? There's a book by Robert Colin called The Master Plan of Evangelism. And in it, he basically talks about how Jesus, what did Jesus do? In his ministry, Jesus, he spent most of it with like 12 guys and going deep with them. He walked past masses all the time. He ran from masses all the time. He ran past people who are sick and needed healing, and yet he bypassed that. Why? Because he seemed to be singularly focused on going deep with a couple handfuls of people. And even within that group, he chose Peter, James, and John to go extremely deep with. But to what end? The goal, the idea behind Jesus going deep with these men was to where when he left and the Holy Spirit came, these men that were left behind, they had been with Jesus and they could exponentially grow the kingdom. Exponentially, they could represent Jesus because they had gone deep with him. But that was what the goal was, is go deep with Jesus so that you can then be Jesus to everybody that needs him. And I found that, our concern for people who are lost spiritually, whether it's there or not, that's primary evidence as to whether we're really going deep with Jesus in a meaningful way. Do you care or do you don't care? Well, if we're not caring for the lost, then we should know we're pretty far off from the heart of God. God cares for the lost. So going, you can't control whether people choose to follow Jesus or how they respond to your invitation to come to church, but we can care. Depth is the priority, but true depth, it will awaken you. It will awaken in you God's heart for people who need Jesus. And lastly, the last thing is that we need all of us in order to reach all kinds of people. We need all of us in order to reach all kinds of people. Clearly, Paul was not interested in just reaching one type of person. He was interested in reaching all types of people. He was not just Jews, but Gentiles, not just the strong, but the weak. Not just people who had a religious background, but people with no concept of who God was. You think how much easier would it have been if Paul was just looking to gather a church based off of one type of person. Jewish community church, or Gentile community church, or outside the law community church. That's actually kind of an awesome name. We should think about that. Outside the law community church. We don't see that. We see the gospel gathering all sorts of people together and not siloing them off from each other. The gospel is uniting all types of people together in one thing, in Jesus Christ. And so here's the point. There are people in your world. Is it just... We okay? It works. My point is this. We're closing with this. There are people in your world that you and you alone are uniquely positioned to reach with Jesus for the gospel. It's so interesting. I've realized this recently. There's some people in my world who I wouldn't necessarily hang out with. I don't have just a ton of things in common with them, and yet for whatever reason, I feel that I have unique favor with them. And I don't care whether I'm a pastor, and yet I just feel like I have favor with them, and so like you need me to in order for them to be reached, you need me to exercise the favor that God has given me with them to share Jesus with them. I think we all have something like that. You have people around you who you are uniquely positioned to reach for Jesus, and we need all of us to do that. We all have a part to play. All of us are needed in order to reach all kinds of people. So as we close, how do you need to respond? How do you need to respond? If you're in Christ, then at some point, somebody, somewhere, got over themselves, got over what they wanted to do that day, their plans, their comfort level, and they got over all of that they might tell you about Jesus. And that's my prayer, is that God would work so much in our hearts to where we would begin to just evaluate and identify things that are perhaps keeping us, whether it's preferences, things that we are clinging to for our own creature comforts, whatever it is, things that perhaps we need to let go of, that we might be best positioned to be reached, to reach people for Jesus. So maybe that's your story. Maybe you're someone, you're trying to figure out this whole Jesus thing, and I just want to say to you, I'm so glad you're here. The reason why we as a church are having this conversation is because there is good news to be shared. There's good news because God looked on sinners like me, sinners like you, and he was not apathetic. He looked on us with love, and that love drove Jesus to a cross where he bore the punishment for all of our sin, all of our shame, and he did it in our place. And he rose from the dead 3 days later, and he offers and extends an invitation to every single one of us, no matter who you are, Jewish, Gentile, consider yourself under the law or outside the law or whatever it is. There's an invitation, and the invitation is just simply turn to Jesus. Look to Jesus. Trust in Jesus. Transfer all of your trust for what gets you into heaven one day, what makes you right in the eyes of God, and where abundant life is found right now. Put it all on Jesus. Have you done that? Here in a moment, I'm going to pray. We're going to have people on my right and your left, and vice versa. If you need someone just to talk to and pray for you, they'll be there. I would love to talk with you and pray with you about that. How do you need to respond today? Let's go to the Lord in prayer.